Hello, economics students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 12, Section 2, Population and Economic Growth. So, our introduction here is, why does the government periodically take a census? Now, granted, it is something that is required by our U.S. Constitution. Part of that is to determine representation within the House of Representatives. We got to decide, which states need more members of the House. But it also kind of helps us understand where people are living, as far as movements of people, talking about demographics in that regard. That kind of gives us a better understanding of what's going on. Counting the population, what are two classifications of population that we might see? There's what we would call the urban population. This would be basically cities. And then our rural population. This would be people who are living outside of big metropolitan areas. Now, if you're looking at a state like Nebraska, the vast majority of the state would be rural population. And that would, certainly include areas that might have more people, a fairly larger town like Norfolk or Columbus, but because they don't have like a big concentration of population, it is considered more rural than it would be urban. There is historical growth. What has been the trend in the rate of population growth since colonial times? Well, crazy as it might seem, it actually is declining, even though our population, for the most part, is getting larger. But you got to understand the rate of growth. Growth isn't, like when we look at historically the amount of people that were coming into our nation years ago, there were high percentages, partially because the numbers were a little bit smaller, but the extremes of the percentages seemed pretty wild. In comparison today, our population is relatively stable in that regard. So certainly it seems kind of odd, but it all kind of makes sense in the scope of things. Regional changes, which parts of the country are growing in population and which are kind of showing some losses. Growth is happening in the southern part of the United States, and also the western areas. They probably be known as the Sun Belt. So if you're looking at places like Texas or Arizona, California, Nevada, these are areas that have grown rapidly in recent years. But there's also the losses that are happening in what would be known as the Rust Belt, or the industrial regions around the Great Lakes in the north, or along the eastern seaboard. So the consequences of growth. What happens when population shifts towards a certain area while growing overall? Well, it puts different pressures on existing resources. So, for example, a state like Nevada in recent years has grown in population fairly quickly. The only problem we have here is that as the population is growing, there's a need for more resources, meaning more money, more roads, more schools, and things like that. And that puts pressure on taxpayers. It puts pressure on the local governments to help pay for these kind of things. So again, when we talk about doing that census, it might lead at some point in time for more resources, because you have more members of government that can go after those things, to come back to that home state. All right. Projected population trends when we talk about age and gender. One of the things that we use to measure this is this thing called a population pyramid that you see below. And ironically, this is something that we're talking about in sociology. Population pyramids, for the most part, are kind of an interesting graphic if you look at it. It's based not only by age, but it's also based on the number of people that are within a certain age group. So if you look at this population pyramid below, the males are on the left-hand side, females are on the right-hand side. If you look at the 85 and up population, there are obviously more women than there are men. And there's some reasons for that. I mean, when we talk about health issues, typically women have a longer life expectancy than guys, and so on. But if you get down into this area around the 50s and such, you can kind of see where our baby boomers are. This kind of decrease here, this would be where our Generation X uh, people are. And then we have our millennials who are here, and then our kind of what you would call our Generation Zs that are coming after. Okay, so what is a population pyramid? It is a type of bar graph that breaks down population by age and gender. Every country has one of these. As a matter of fact, you can make these for cities. What's interesting is if you look at them for cities, you can see like the difference of, like, let's say a college town or a college or a city that's got a college in it, like Lincoln. Uh, it tends to have higher concentrations of populations of college age students, which is kind of interesting to see that. Or if you have a community where there is a lot of retirees, certainly it would probably be a little, the trend would be for higher population counts in our senior citizen age bracket and such. Okay, what is the dependency ratio? This is the number of children and elderly people in a population for every 100 persons that are working age. Okay, so what's interesting is if you would take um, maybe a town like Tallahassee, Florida, or Tampa, Florida, which might have higher concentrations of elderly people, you're going to need more younger or working age people to offset the needs of the retirees. And if you were in Laredo, Texas, where there are far more younger people, because that is a border town right on the border between Texas and Mexico, again, you're going to need more working people, aged people, to offset the numbers of young people who are dependents. Okay, so that's what these population pyramids can kind of help us with. Race and ethnicity. What group is currently the largest component of the total population? If you take a look at our graph below, you'll see that whites are, okay, because they make predominantly a higher group. Though, if you keep looking at the projections for, let's say, 2050, our minority population is going to be growing, and the number of white or Caucasians is going to kind of narrow as far as percentiles. It doesn't mean that there are going to be less white people here. It just means that the overall percentage of the entire population, um, the minority groups are going to start growing a little bit more. Anyway, what is the other racial or ethnic group that make up the total population? That would be African Americans. For a long, long time, African Americans were kind of the biggest minority group, but really around 1990 that changed, and Hispanics became the largest minority group here in the United States. So African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans would all be figured into that. All right. Population growth. What are the three most important factors affecting population growth? Well, that would be your fertility rate, which is basically the number of babies that are being born within a country. Life expectancy, how long a person is going to live. And then the net immigration rate, and that is like how many new immigrants are coming into this country. Future population growth. What is expected of the population rate of the future? It's going to grow slowly. Okay, it's going to grow more slowly. It's not going to be as fast as it has been in the past. So it's going to start lagging a little bit. That might be offset by other nations of the world where population growth might be a little more rapid. All right, thank you very much.